Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Marvin Williams here, and this is our Better Together conversation. Good evening, good evening. In our Better Together conversations, we take a potentially hot topic or a hot topic that potentially has can divide us, and we look for the common thread to actually unify us. And so, because we are better together, say that again, we are better together. And tonight we're going to tackle a kind of a touchy subject, but it's a relevant subject. We're going to be talking about domestic violence. And it's a significant topic for us to tackle as the church. This is something that we don't normally talk about. We kind of sweep it under the rug, and we don't actually engage this. And yet there are people in our congregation who may be going through a very difficult time and not knowing what to do. Well, tonight we're going to hopefully we're going to give some answers to some of your questions. And hey, don't forget, as you engage this time, don't forget to like our page if you're on Facebook, and if you're on YouTube, don't forget to like our channel. We want to be able to share this information with as many people as possible. And again, if you are watching this right now, please share this link, share this broadcast with a friend or family member. And if they're not able to watch it now, of course, they can watch the broadcast later. And so I'm your host, Marvin Williams, and it is my privilege to be with you tonight. We have a special guest who's going to help us engage this conversation. Our special guest tonight is Joy Wittenberg from Eve, that is ending violent encounters. End violent encounters. Joy Wittenberg. I feel like I know you because you've been with us a couple of times now, three times. Joy, welcome to the broadcast, and we're so glad that you're with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I've gotten to know you and your congregation very well over the past couple weeks, and it's been a pleasure, honestly. It's a very receptive group, a group that I feel really wants to help survivors in the community, which is fantastic for us. So yes, I am with Eve, that stands for End Violent Encounters. We are the domestic violence shelter in Lansing, and we also provide sexual assault response services as well as personal protective order services, really anything that a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault might need in the Lansing area.
Well, thank you. Listen, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And man, I want to jump right in because we have a lot to cover, and we want to try to provide as much information as possible. And again, this is a conversation for that you and I are having, but there's a whole host of people watching right now. And for those of you who are watching on all of our platforms, any of our platforms, we welcome you tonight. And thank you for being generous with your time to join our Better Together conversation tonight. Okay, Joy, let's jump right in. So what is domestic violence or domestic abuse? Now, we had a little conversation earlier where you say, okay, there's not a difference between the two. So talk to us about what is domestic violence, domestic abuse.
Right. So we use both of those terms, domestic violence and domestic abuse, basically interchangeably, because the laws in different states tend to use them interchangeably as well. They're describing essentially the same thing. But domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship where one partner is trying to maintain control or exert power over another partner. And these are usually intimate relationships when we're talking about domestic violence. So that could be between a husband and wife. It could be between a dating couple who's living together or not living together. It can be between same-sex couples. Anytime you're in a intimate relationship with someone and there is one person controlling another, we identify that as domestic violence.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that's pretty comprehensive. So we can say that domestic violence is not necessarily uncommon. There's a scope to this, right? This is not just something in a corner. There is a broad scope to this. Talk to us a little bit about the scope of domestic violence.
Yeah, so domestic violence is unfortunately a very common problem because it encompasses a number of different behaviors that sometimes we like to put into different categories, but they all fall under the category of domestic violence. So when we're talking about domestic violence, we're talking about physical abuse, of course, which includes a number of things. We're also talking about sexual abuse, financial abuse, emotional and psychological abuse, and certainly spiritual abuse falls within that emotional and psychological abuse. Um, so all of those different forms of abuse are categorized as domestic violence. They don't all have to happen at the same time, but oftentimes if you're seeing one form of abuse happening, there's very frequently other forms of abuse happening as well. So about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience domestic violence at some point in their life in some form or fashion. Although that number for men, I do have to point out, um, men tend to underreport domestic violence for a number of reasons, and that number has been steadily rising in the past few years. So that depending on who you talk to, you may get a different number somewhere between 1 in 6, 1 in 7 men.
So that's a very interesting. I mean, that's a very interesting statistic, particularly for men. Why you said there's a variety of reasons why men don't report. What are some of those reasons why men don't report domestic violence?
So one of the reasons is that there's a stigma attached to what masculinity is supposed to look like, and so there's a lot of shame surrounding someone who has been abused and that they may not be much of a man anymore, especially if we're
Mhm.
talking about sexual violence. But the other thing that we sometimes see is that sometimes we don't recognize all forms of domestic abuse as being violence when it's being perpetrated against a man. So oftentimes things like emotional abuse, belittling someone, humiliating them, doing things to break them down is sometimes not seen as domestic abuse, and it is. And if we're seeing it happen in the direction of a woman to a man, sometimes we don't recognize it as domestic violence.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. And I mean, again, it's one of those myths out there that women cannot abuse men, but the statistics are very clear that at least the 1 in 6 or 1 in 7, and probably higher, depending on who you talk to, it is a very real issue that it just doesn't go from a man abusing a woman, but it can go from a woman abusing a man or other. Again, if you're in a again same sex relationship, obviously that can happen as well. So wow, that's very interesting. So talk to you. You mentioned a few forms of abuse. Now we're going to try to get into some of the specifics of the different forms of abuse. Now, kind of run through those forms of abuse again for us.
So, physical abuse is probably the one that most people think of first when we talk about domestic violence. But physical abuse doesn't just mean hitting someone. Physical abuse also encompasses things like slamming doors, punching walls, destroying property, harming pets. Really, anything that's using physical force to maintain control or potentially intimidate your partner is considered physical abuse. Sexual abuse is another one that we see a lot of times in tandem, but sometimes on its own. But it's any kind of sexual violence that's used against their partner. One of the things that sometimes gets overlooked is coercion is abuse. If you don't have enthusiastic consent from your partner, that is sexual abuse. So if you're using any kind of leverage or potential consequences or even cultural beliefs to pressure someone into performing sexually in any way, that falls under the category of sexual abuse. Um, Let's see what the next one is.
So
Emotional and psychological. Oh,
before we go to the next one, so sexual abuse is fairly common in our culture right now. I mean, some of the sexual abuse is reported, some is not reported. So why do you think this is such a cultural issue for us right now? Sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual abuse. Why do you think it's the numbers are rising right now?
yeah, so sexual abuse is very prevalent. Every 73 seconds, someone in America is sexually
Wow.
assaulted. Um, there's a debate over whether or not the number of sexual assaults are actually increasing or if they're just being reported more frequently. And there's no way for me to know which one is true. My sense is that it isn't necessarily increasing, is that we are recognizing sexual abuse more readily and people are starting to speak out a little bit more about it. But historically, speaking out against somebody who has sexually assaulted you has not been a good situation for the survivor. Very infrequently are cases even prosecuted. And if they are, most of the time, the perpetrator never sees a day in jail or even receives much of a punishment at all. So there are a lot of reasons why the incidence of actually reporting sexual assault has historically not been uh, well utilized by survivors, if that makes sense.
Okay. So let me I want to stay with this one just for a little bit. So you have a number of men who have the thinking that if a woman dresses a certain way, or if a woman says or does certain things, or is somehow extremely flirtatious, then that gives the abuser the right and the freedom to actually abuse and sexually assault that person and feel innocent about doing it because it really wasn't my fault per se. It was she kind of put herself in that situation. What would you say to that?
Um, yeah, that is a very common thing that we hear, unfortunately. But abuse is never, ever the fault of the person being abused. It just isn't. There's nothing that someone can do that would warrant them being taken advantage of or being abused by another person. But sexual abuse specifically is one where we hear that a lot. Because again, it is about control. All forms of domestic violence is a form of power and control. That's what it comes down to. So even sexual abuse isn't really about the sexual act itself. It's about
Right,
maintaining control over another
right,
person. So you'll hear a lot of unhealthy ways to describe this. I've heard terms like corrective rape or other things that we call it, where the abusers will actually use rape as a form of punishment to deter the survivor from behaving in certain ways or doing certain things. Um, but it's all about control. So if your response to somebody dressing a certain way is that they have been asking for it, that's really putting on display some really unhealthy gender roles, which is a
yeah,
big contributing factor to why sexual assault is viewed as potentially the survivor's fault sometimes. But it's that sense of entitlement to another person. It's that sense
right.
of some people being more equal than others that allows people to think that they can take what they want and use that sexual assault as a way to control their partner.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you for I mean that clears up a lot. Again, it dispels these myths or even this warped mindset in some people's minds that that it's the abuser's fault as they are abused and assaulted. So let's turn the corner a little bit and talk about which is this is a very interesting form of abuse, psychological and emotional. And again, and this is probably it's probably more prevalent than we think as well. So talk to us a little bit about what psychological and emotional abuse is.
So psychological and emotional abuse and spiritual abuse falls under this umbrella, is using your words or your actions to help maintain the idea that your partner is powerless or not good enough in some way. It's a way of humiliating your partner, and keeping them in their place, essentially. So, this is critical to somebody being able to effectively control their partner. And we talked about this a little bit in some other groups, but um, one of the reasons it's so difficult for survivors to seek help or to leave an abusive situation is that by the time they get to a really physically violent outburst from their partner, they've already been emotionally and psychologically conditioned to believe that they deserve what's going on. Oftentimes, they've been effectively gaslit, which is that idea of convincing someone to believe what you say rather than what they're seeing with their own eyes. But they've been so effectively gaslit that no matter what their abuser does to them, they believe that they either deserve it or that the other options are so much worse. So things like, if I didn't love you, nobody else would, or you make me act this way. If you wouldn't do this, I wouldn't get so angry. Or if every person who you've ever been with has treated you this way, what do you think the common factor is? Things like that, that can over time seep into somebody's emotional well being and tear down their self esteem to the point where they honestly start to believe that this is all that they deserve.
Wow, wow. That is again so interesting. So here are two kind of follow-up questions. Um, the first one is, and there are individuals who say this. Well, how come you just don't have a strong enough mind to just not believe what the abuser is saying? And then the second thing that I suppose that makes the psychological and emotional abuse work so well is isolation. Because if there are other people around them, if that person is connected to a community, they can say, "Listen, girl, man, you're not crazy. What you're seeing is actually true." So talk to us a little bit about, um, is it just having a strong enough mind to actually say, "I'm not going to believe this," number 1, and then making sure that, if you are experiencing some sort of psychological and emotional abuse, that you stay connected to a community.
I think you're spot on with that. So, I will say that this is one of those reasons why I think churches are uniquely positioned to help survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. I don't want to get too far off track, but um, I'm not typically the one for Eve who does these outreach and these presentations. I'm not the educational person. But I do the outreach to churches specifically because I was raised in church. I was raised by a Baptist preacher. And I myself am a survivor of domestic violence. And I am somebody that, if you knew me personally, if you want to talk about a strong mind and a strong will, I am highly educated. I am very, very pushy, and some would say bossy most of the time. And if you asked anybody who knew me, even during when this abuse was happening, no one would have guessed that this was going on
Wow.
in my home because I am not a meek and mild person by any sense of the word. And yet it was happening to me in part because of what you're describing. That isolation is necessary for abuse to continue long term, for exactly the reasons that you stated. Um, if the only person that you're ever hearing from is your abuser and they keep
Wow.
telling you something over and over, eventually
Yeah.
you will start to doubt yourself. So, maintaining those connections with healthy family members or people at work or your community. And I think if you're in a healthy congregation at church, maintaining those support systems makes it harder for somebody to isolate their victim and keep perpetuating these lies over and over to them. Because exactly what you said, if I'm talking to my friends and I mention something that my spouse or my partner has said to me and it sounds off, they're going to speak up and say something, which is going
Yeah.
to make it harder for somebody who's trying to abuse me to keep convincing me that what I'm seeing with my own eyes is not what's happening.
Yeah, yeah. That is so good. That is so good, Joy. Hey, listen, everybody, we are in this Better Together conversation with Joy Wittenberg from Eve, End Violent Encounters, and again, she is talking to us about domestic violence, and so just a really, really good conversation. Hey, if you have questions or comments, please drop them in the chat right now. because this is a very, very important conversation. Now, another form, Joy, of domestic violence, um, or domestic abuse, kind of using those terms interchangeably, is financial and legal abuse. Now, until you mentioned this, I mean, I had a sense of what this was, but this was really a kind of an eye opening one for me, particularly the legal one, the legal abuse. So, talk to us a little bit about what is financial abuse and what is legal abuse in the scope of domestic violence.
Right. So financial abuse is a really tough one, and it creates really difficult barriers for somebody if they do decide that they want to leave an abusive situation. But financial abuse basically is when an abuser uses money to maintain control over their partner. And there's a lot of ways they can do this, whether it's um, taking the survivor's paycheck immediately, and they're the only ones who knows what the bills are and what gets paid or even what money is coming in, all the way to actually stealing money from their partner, or only giving them a small allowance, and that allowance can
Wow.
only be used for family needs, and typically that allowance is not nearly enough to cover the family needs, all the way up to sometimes the abusive person will make it impossible for somebody to hold down a job so that they are more dependent on them, so that if they ever do think about leaving, the idea of where would I go and how would I afford to live on my own and take care of my kids? I can't even hold down a job and I don't have any money coming in. It makes it extremely complicated to leave.
So when you say trying to hold down a job, so you may have someone who goes to the job and disrupts the job and does it so often where the boss says, "Hey, listen, we just simply cannot have these kinds of disruptions and interruptions. In fact, it's affecting your performance. So I'm sorry, we're going to have to let you go." Is that what you're talking about?
That's part of what I'm talking about, certainly, where somebody can either make phone calls into the place of work so frequently and harass them over the phone, or even start harassing coworkers that, yes, there's such a disruption that, a boss can't allow it at work anymore. Or even doing things like restricting access to a vehicle or
Wow.
access to
Yeah.
money to get to work, or um,
Yeah.
making them constantly late to work for small things at home, or even just making it so embarrassing to go into work, and be able to interact with their coworkers, or constant accusing and blame of infidelity or disloyalty while that person is at work, making it so that they can't interact with their coworkers the way that they need to be.
Or even focus and concentrate on their job because they're constantly thinking about either what the abuser is doing, or is he or she going to show up at my job today? And so there's a sense, I would imagine, there's like I can't even focus and concentrate on the job that I'm supposed to do. Wow, that's just again. Hey, listen, everybody, if you're, again, those who are listening, if you've experienced this, man, we are, again, this is part of the reason we're doing it. We stand with you, we stand next to you, and our heart breaks for you if you've gone through something like this. Again, this is the reason why we're having this conversation tonight. It has to be exposed in order for healing to take place. And we're with Joy Wittenberg from Eve. And we're, again, just so grateful that she's generous with her time to be with us. Now, talk to us. This was kind of a newer one for me, legal abuse, and it kind of is connected a little bit to financial abuse, but talk to us a little bit about what legal abuse is. And this might be something new for a lot of people hearing this tonight.
Sure. So there's a lot of facets to legal abuse that people don't expect. But the legal system is very often weaponized against survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and they do it in a number of ways. So if the person is still in a relationship, they might be threatened with things like, if you ever leave me, I'll take the kids. Um, if we're talking about somebody who is an undocumented person, there's always that threat of calling ICE on them and getting them deported. And of course, if you have children with that person and the children are citizens, that means that you may be deported, leaving your children with an abusive person. There's sometimes we see where If somebody is effectively gaslit enough, there's threats to have them declared incompetent. Or if they have a disability, taking away the power to make their own medical decisions, which of course puts them in an even more vulnerable situation. And then if somebody does decide to leave, the barriers to finding legal help can be so extreme. There's the financial aspect of it, where frequently you can't afford an attorney because of the financial abuse that we've talked about. Oftentimes, the resources out there that are for survivors are income based, but of course, they look at the income of the entire household, which includes your abuser's income, which you may not have access to.
Wow.
I know last year alone, actually this current year, Eve has a staff attorney, and on average, her caseload was so overwhelmed, we had to turn away on average 7 to 10 survivors every single month who needed free legal services because she was so maxed out on how many people she was helping. That's how many people are being dragged back into court over and over again, having their resources drained, missing time at work, missing time at their kids' school stuff, having to be re-traumatized facing their abuser in court alone if they don't have someone to go with them. So the whole point of this aspect of legal abuse is it's often the last way that an abuser can control their victim and
Wow.
basically make it so difficult to be away from them that it's easier to just come back.
Wow. Wow. Man, I mean, when you said that, my heart broke over that because it's virtually you're in a no-win situation. And I would imagine at some point the abused gets so fed up that just say, you know, something is just better to take my own life than to go back to this particular situation. Are you seeing with that, do you see a higher number of suicides and suicide attempts because in abusive situations?
That's not something that I have the numbers on, and I
Okay.
wouldn't, based on what I know, what is more likely to happen is that the survivor is put into such a precarious position that they end up going back to an abusive home. And it's often not for their own, I guess, salvation is the only word I can think of. But if we're talking about custody issues and trying to get custody taken away from an abusive person, if you're a parent who's faced with the choice of either taking the abuse yourself and standing between you and your kids, or potentially having an abusive person have unrestricted access to your children 50% of the time, as a parent, I think we know what choice we're going to make. So if
Yeah.
you're not able to get enough representation to get custody of your children, that's a very common reason why people end up going back to violent
Yeah.
homes.
Wow, wow. So I'm just gonna go a little personal here, for you in terms of how do you manage? I mean, you have these numbers, you have the personal experience, but you also have connections with individuals who your Eve is seeing on a regular basis, even though you're not directly associated with the counseling part, you are in it. How do you manage and how do you stay above water and what feeds your soul as you listen to stories and hear stories often? How do you kind of how do you maintain?
Um, I have to just be totally transparent with you because of what my role at Eve is. I am not the one who is frequently in contact with survivors. Most frequently, I'll have somebody at an event come up to me and tell me their story. So I do get exposed to it to some extent, not anywhere close to what our counselors and our advocates get exposed to. But I will tell you what does help is our team of directors for each of those departments is very careful to keep an eye on their staff and watch out for secondary trauma because it's a very real problem that if you're listening to constant stories of abuse and violence and control like that, it can be very re-traumatizing. And a good portion of us are survivors ourselves, right? So our directors look out for their team very closely to watch out for that. And then we do our best to communicate with each other the success stories that happened. Last night, I was talking to a group and we had somebody on the call who used our services tell us about it. And she's now in a very safe situation. She seems very happy and healthy. And I immediately, as soon as I hung up, I just emailed the whole team. Hey guys, I don't know who worked with this person, but this is what she told me. And we got one out and we helped a person, right? So we like to share those stories as often as possible because it reminds us of why we do this. We're not able to fix every situation. We're very much empowerment based. People have to decide to take those steps. But when they do and when they let us help them, those are the times that we share it with the entire team so that we can keep going.
Yeah, that is so good. That is so good. Community is so key in not only for the abused and survivors, but also those who are helping them as well. So let's turn the corner a little bit because we want to get into a little bit more specifics. Now, no perpetrator is ever going to wear a sign to say "I am an abuser." No one is going to ever say that. We kind of wish they would, so we'll know, but no one is ever going to say that. So, what are some characteristics of an abuse perpetrator? It can be a CEO of a company, it can be a deacon, it can be a pastor, it can be literally anybody. So, what are some characteristics? Not that we're going to be walking around saying, "Okay, looking for those signs," but what are some characteristics that you would say are signs and symptoms of the abuser? And then what are some symptoms of someone who might we might suspect who's being abused?
You're exactly right about people who are abusive. It's not obvious most of the time. And I think we get ourselves in trouble and we miss things if we're looking for the bad guy who's just an awful person all the way around. Because very frequently, people who are abusive to their partners or to people at home are not abusive to other people in their lives. It doesn't translate
Wow.
to every relationship they have. They may be very kind and loving to the people that they minister to or to the people that they work with. But at home, they're trying to control and intimidate their partner. So, some of the characteristics, and nobody is exactly the same, but one thing that is consistent, people who do not take responsibility for their own actions, it's always somebody else's fault. If they did something wrong, it's because somebody else made them do it, or they're responding to another situation that's outside of their control, or trying to justify why they did something or why it was necessary, or why this person deserved it in some way. Oftentimes, we'll have people try to blame alcohol or drugs.
Hmm,
And that's
hmm.
simply not the case. Sometimes there is alcohol and drugs happening at the same time, but that's never causing the abuse at all. And mental illness doesn't cause abuse either.
Wow. So talk to us a little bit about that. You say mental illness doesn't cause abuse. Talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, that's a big statement, because you know, yeah, it's a big statement because people say, I did not, my mental faculties weren't there, and so I ended up doing something that I regretted. So talk to us a little bit about why mental illness does not cause abuse.
Yeah, so we do hear that sometimes, especially if something goes to prosecution or if somebody's going to counseling with their partner. They'll say things like, I just snapped, I just lost control. And
Yeah.
that's simply not the case. Abuse is about control. So the abuser has
Mm,
not lost control
yeah.
when they have an explosive incident, whether it's a physical incident or a sexual assault. They are 100% in control. And they're usually in control enough to set up situations where they're likely to not get caught and not go far enough that there are permanent repercussions, which is
Yeah.
how we kind of prove that that's the case. But mental illness is never a situation that causes abuse. And we know that in part because there are many people who are mentally ill who do not seek to control other people. And even if you do have a mental illness in any capacity, you are still responsible for your actions. People who are unable to control themselves, or people who are mentally incapacitated do not seek out other people to control and to
Mm,
harm. And they're usually not
good
in a
point.
position where they have the power to maintain control over another person.
Yeah, good point. Good point. So let me ask another. This is a there may be someone out there who, and this kind of takes us back just a tad bit. If we're talking about physical abuse, or sexual abuse, and the individuals say, I only did it one time. And so please do not put me and characterize me as an abuser. Please do not characterize me as the one who is doing the harm. I just did it one time, and I won't do it again, and I've never done it again. What would you say to that kind of reasoning? It's just this one time, so I must not be an abuser.
So, abuse, if somebody gets away with it, escalates. So, it may start out as something that doesn't seem as terrible as maybe physical abuse or sexual assault. Although I will tell you that survivors of any kind of abuse, oftentimes the emotional and psychological damage that is done is what many survivors say is far worse and stays with them longer than the physical assaults that happen, right? So abuse does escalate. It is very rare that abuse starts with an explosive physical incident. So even if you only hit that person one time, there likely was other forms of abuse leading up to that. I would also say that it only takes one time to establish fear and dominance in another person. Once you show
Wow,
that you're
that's good.
capable of harming someone,
That's good.
you don't always have to go through on threats to get them to do what you want them to do.
That's really powerful because, yeah, just you know, if and again, this is I don't want to compare this to this, but if a dog snaps at you once, then you now have fear of that dog. And so if a person, does, physically harm or sexually abuse, then it could be that one time, and you establish a baseline, you establish a point of control, and now that person, the abused or the survivor, the abused is thinking, "Oh, it could happen again." And so now you begin walking on eggshells, and I better not say anything. I better not do anything to get that person upset again. If that would that be again, would that be commensurate to what you're saying?
That's absolutely what I'm trying to say is that it only takes one time to prove that you're capable of taking back
Yeah.
control if they push hard enough to maintain that control. And oftentimes they don't even have to physically harm you. They could harm your pet. They could harm someone that you care about. They could harm your property to basically say, I did it here, I can do it again. But even if we pretend that it was just that one time that somebody abused a person, the the lifelong scars that happen to somebody who has been abused,
Yeah.
it's bad enough.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, wow. That's again really interesting. So what are some of the symptoms of those who either have been or are being abused? Now we talked a little bit about the characteristics of the abuser, the perpetrator, but what are some signs and symptoms of someone who might be being abused?
Yeah, and these are the ones that we actually encourage people to look for. It's highly unlikely that you're going to recognize an abusive person, even if you know them very well. You may, but it's unlikely. You're more likely to recognize that someone you know or have met is in an abusive situation. So there are certain things to look out for, and I'll say this with a bit of a caveat. One or two of these things on their own may or may not mean that somebody is in an abusive relationship. If you start seeing several things stack up, these are things that should just alert you to keep an eye on the situation and make sure that you're available and not allowing this person to become isolated, right? So things like new and unexplained depression, anxiety, lack of energy that isn't normal for them, changes in their sleep and their appetite. And this is especially tough anytime winter comes, right? Because we have seasonal affective disorder. With the pandemic going on right now, people are staying home. So there's all kinds of mental things that are happening with people, right? So it's tough to
Yeah.
differentiate. But if you're seeing that and it's not normal for this person, and you're seeing it coupled with other things like low self esteem is a big one. Low self esteem sometimes happens with depression. But not always, and not in somebody who isn't prone to depression. So if you're seeing this, a persistent sadness, and they're suddenly very down on themselves and don't feel good enough or worthy anymore, that's a really good sign. Obviously, anything that is a self-harming behavior, if they're actually wanting to act out on something where they're physically harming themselves, that comes from that psychological abuse of being not good enough or being just a bad person is what they're now starting to believe. Some of the things we tell people at work to look for is a decrease in work productivity or a change in how much work they're getting done, as well as if you notice that somebody at work doesn't want to go home. Or in a church setting, if you're noticing that somebody wants to be at every single meeting and every single activity and they don't want to go home, maybe start asking why that is and looking for other things that might signal something. An increase in any kind of substance abuse may or may not mean that violence is happening, but it may be their way of coping with an increase in violence. Withdrawing from relationships or groups that they're in. And this is a tough one. And this is the one that you really have the power to help slow down. It will be in their best interest if people continue to reach out, even if they're not reciprocating. They may not be allowed to join in groups anymore. They may be being pressured or flat out just forbidden to be a part of things. I would encourage you to still reach out and stay in touch as much as you can so that when that person is ready to ask for help, they know who to go to. If they're mentioning that it's their partner specifically who doesn't want them doing that, that's kind of a red flag. Now, there is a difference between, my husband is concerned that I'm exhausted all the time because I'm in 14 groups at church. So he'd like me to pick just 4. That's probably a healthy relationship versus, my wife doesn't want me to be a part of this ministry at all. And I have to be home, and they stop showing up altogether, right? Any signs that they're controlling the means of communication, they're monitoring their text messages, they're constantly texting their partner when they're in group activities, and the partner seems agitated or as if they have to immediately respond, and they're afraid of what might happen if they don't. And then any visible signs of physical abuse, such as black eyes, clothing that's not appropriate for the season that we're in, extreme use of makeup when that wasn't normal before, anything like that.
Yeah. This is wow. This is again, I love the fact that you mentioned that any one of these could be any one of these alone is not necessarily a symptom and a sign of abuse. But when you get a conglomeration of these or several of these, and a lot of these things are, again, this person is acting out of the ordinary, then it's something that we do need to pay close attention to. So that's a good segue. It's a good segue. As followers of Jesus, when we hear this and see this, what should our response be? Does the Bible have anything to say about, again, the injustice that manifests itself in domestic violence and domestic abuse? So, what would you, as followers of Jesus, what is our response to this?
This I'm so passionate about, and my dad jokes with me all the time that I should have been a pastor, because this is where I get very very passionate about my stance on this. I think the Bible is very, very clear about how we are supposed to be a light in our community and how our responsibility to the weakest and most vulnerable among us, it falls on Christians to be the ones who are the ones that stand between the people who would do harm and the people who are being harmed. And while I don't know that the Bible specifically addresses domestic violence, because I'm not sure that it was called that back then, there were a lot of cultural things that were not called what they are, right? But it does speak to a lot of issues. And we're talking about sexual assault and, the way she was dressed, she was asking for it. The Bible specifically says that if your right eye offends you, to pluck it out. It's your problem to deal with the sin of lust in your life, not somebody else to make sure that you don't commit a sin, right? The Bible talks about being the one who keeps people from being led down to the slaughter. And that may seem dramatic to some people when we're talking about domestic violence or emotional abuse, but it really isn't. 1 in 3 women in America who are murdered by an intimate partner. If
Wow.
violence is allowed to escalate without intervention, it will eventually end in fatalities. But besides that, we are not called to oppress people. We are called to lift each other up and to be the example to the world of how Christ has chosen us to act. And I think that the Bible is very clear, especially when we look at how Jesus behaved in the New Testament. He consistently sided with and stood next to and defended and protected the weakest and most vulnerable of people: prostitutes, the disabled people, blind people, people who were outcast of society, who nobody believed or really gave any credence to. Consistently, every time, Jesus stood next to them and basically berated the people who were in positions of power as to their response to them. And I think that while it doesn't say domestic violence specifically in the Bible, I don't think you can read the Bible and take anything away from it other than Christ stands with the people who are oppressed, and he stands with those who are the most vulnerable, and we're called to do the same.
Girl, you're preaching. You are preaching.
I
You
told
really
you.
are.
Yeah.
Listen, the doors of the church are open. Let's do the invitation now so people can give their lives to Jesus. Seriously, that is a good word. And if you go back to the very beginning, right, that we are all image bearers. We are all created in the image of God. And to mar and taint and destroy the image of God in another human being, which domestic violence is doing and is perpetrating, we are violating we're violating, number one, what it means to be human. And number two, again, if we're followers of Jesus, it is we're violating what it means to be followers of Jesus. Now it's interesting. Here's an ironic part. So you're gonna have to help me through this. So how so if the church is supposed to be the shalom of God in the world, and the church can't be the shalom of God and the perpetrator or the hideout for abusers at the same time. So how give us a word to the church on how we can be the shalom of God and not necessarily, if we know that abuse is taking place, whether, in a small group or among individuals who are in leadership or not necessarily leadership, how do we address that?
That's a great question, and I think for some people it's sticky. I think for me, there's a pretty clear line that we're called as Christians as how we're supposed to respond. So yes, churches are supposed to be places for the hurting and the broken to come and to heal. It's also supposed to be a place that reaches out to their community and offers healing and the light of the Lord to their community, right? So I do think that this redemption narrative that Christianity has, which is true, I believe in the transformational power of the Word of God. I believe that that's true. I've seen it happen. While that is true, I think that redemption narrative does set churches up to be a place where abusive people and people who want control see an opportunity to basically have access to folks who are willing to give second and third and fourth chances, right? So you have to be careful of that sort of thing. So, what I would say is that while you don't necessarily have to choose between serving the abused and the abuser, when people make choices in their life and an abusive person has made a choice to abuse another person, when you make a choice and when you commit a sin, whatever that sin is, there are consequences to that. And some of those consequences are lifelong, which means that if you are somebody who has been violent to another person in any form, so I'm talking sexual abuse, domestic violence, that's physical, you lose access to those people. It doesn't mean that you can't get forgiveness from God. It does mean that you don't get to be in a position where you have power or the ability to abuse someone else again. And I believe that that's a biblical concept, that we're supposed to protect the vulnerable while we serve other folks. But I would also say that there's a difference between somebody who is truly penitent and trying to change what they're doing and somebody who just wants to move on to the next thing and not
Yeah.
experience the consequences of their choices. And we need to be careful of those things.
Yeah, that's really good because we've seen manipulation and they call, when you're in jail, those that jailhouse salvation, right?
Mhm,
And in order to get some good time, and if you get good time, you can get out a little bit earlier. And so and I know, one of the characteristics of an abuser is manipulation. And and if they can maintain access to the person that they're controlling, they will more than likely do anything and say anything and memorize scripture and sing really passionately these worship songs. And yet
mhm.
in the background, they are continuing their abuse. And so as leaders, I think we have to watch that. And I think we have to not be afraid and not have a failure of nerve to call out what needs to be called out at the appropriate time. So this is
I
really,
would
really good. Hey,
yeah,
go ahead, Joy.
and I'm sorry, Pastor Mark. But
No,
I
go
do
ahead.
need to add here that one of the responsibilities of a church body as a whole is to be a light to their community. And if and I don't know how prevalent this is anymore. I know when I was growing up, there was an idea in some of the churches that were in the denomination I was raised in that church issues were handled internally. We deal with that here as a church. And I have seen what happens to a church's testimony and their ability to affect a community and to serve a community effectively when they do not handle abuse in the appropriate way, which
Yeah.
means reporting things when they happen and working with law enforcement and working with your local ordinances and what needs to happen if you know that abuse is happening, right? So the difference is if you try to keep things internally and you don't use the proper channels and you don't call out sin when you see it, it is extremely likely that you will lose your access to be able to serve the community. And if you're not serving your community, then you're basically just a social club, aren't you?
Wow. Wow. You just nailed it. And that's a strong prophetic word for a lot of churches that know of abuse and maybe hiding out the abuser because of the fear of it's going to get out into the community, and we're going to lose our standing or our reputation. The ironic part is if you don't report it, it's still going to get out in the community, and then you're going to end up having a it's going to be worse than had you talked about it from the outset. This is really good. Hey, we are with Joy Wittenberg from Eve, and we're talking about domestic violence. And this is a very, very important conversation in our culture right now. And please text your questions and your comments. You can text your questions to 989 We got a little bit more, and then we're going to get into the question. So let's play a little true and false game. All right. And again, this is not, we know that domestic violence is not a game, but I think this is important for us to maybe dispel some myths that are out there. So here is a statement, and you tell me true or false. All right. And then give me a little bit of your preacher in you to, I'm just kidding. So, uh, leaving the abuser is always the safest option, true or false?
False. While we do not encourage anyone to stay in a violent situation, leaving the abusive relationship is the most dangerous time in that relationship. A woman is 7 times more likely to be murdered by their partner in the months following leaving an abusive relationship. So,
Wow.
we're not telling you to stay. I am telling you to reach out and get help so that you can get a safety plan in place.
And we're going to talk about the safety plan in a few minutes. So please, please don't leave because we really want to talk about that because that's another a very, very important piece of this puzzle. All right. So here's another one. Times of disaster create more abusive people. Now again, we are in COVID, and we have heard that COVID has caused more or created abusive people. True or false?
False. Natural disasters, stress, financial stress, loss of work, none of that creates an abusive situation or creates an abusive person. It can exacerbate existing issues. it can increase the severity of the abuse that's happening. We have seen the fatality rates increase, but it did not create abuse out of a situation that was otherwise healthy.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. You know, again, we see the statistics that obviously COVID has exacerbated the situation or exacerbated abuse. We've seen the numbers go up. What are some other times of the year where you see abuse spike?
Um, Anytime you see abusers having more access to their victims, which is why you see it spike in times of a global pandemic. This is new. But anytime we have a natural disaster, a hurricane or something like that, that prevents people from going to work or to the store, or things that would naturally be a time to de escalate a situation or give them a break from a situation, that's when you see domestic violence start to occur a little more frequently and the severity to increase. Something that we did not anticipate happening with this pandemic, but has, is the rate of sexual assault has significantly increased. But we probably should have seen it coming. Most of the time, 4 out of 5 times that somebody is sexually assaulted, it is from somebody that they know. So, of course, having more access to their victim during a global pandemic would, of course, increase those rates and the opportunities for an abusive person to continue that abuse. So, anytime that there's more access to their victim,
Sure,
so if there's breaks between school or over the holidays when people have time off work, things like that.
sure. Very good, very good. Here's another one. Perpetrators focus their abuse on their partners and their partners only. True or false?
That is also false. So, it is not always true that somebody who abuses their partner abuses children as well, but it is very often true. So, up to 60% of the time, if somebody is abusing their partner, they're also abusing the children in their home.
Wow, wow. That's very interesting. Very interesting. So here's another one. Um, did I lose you?
I'm here.
Okay, maybe where am I?
I can still see you too.
Okay. All right, so let me here's another one. Um, most survivors of sexual assault do not know their assailants. True or false?
That is false. So, yeah, 4 out of 5 times the person knows the person who has assaulted them. In fact, most of the time, well, not most, almost half of the time, when somebody is sexually assaulted, it occurs while they're sleeping or they're doing something around their own home.
Wow. Okay. All right. Okay. Sexual assault has a higher rate of false reporting than other crimes. We've heard this over and over again that that's a false report. They're false reporting. And so that's the reason we shouldn't believe them. True or false, it is a higher rate of false reporting than other crimes.
That is absolutely false. In fact, it is less than 2% of the time that it is a false report if somebody makes an allegation of sexual assault. And I alluded to the reasons why earlier, but there is no incentive for somebody to falsely, very little incentive to falsely accuse someone of sexual assault. In fact, it's extremely difficult to even start an allegation like that because historically not much comes of it. It's an extremely difficult thing to prosecute, and the stakes are so high
Yeah.
to even prove it that you're really taking a gamble to do it. I will say that we are getting better at that sort of thing. So there's a group in the Lansing area called KSART, the Capital Area Sexual Assault Response Team, that Eve works with very closely. And it's a group of judges, prosecutors, law enforcement, medical professionals, some folks from Sparrow Hospital with their SANE nurses who all work together to find ways to help survivors of sexual assault be able to navigate the process after they're assaulted in a less traumatizing way. So there are a group of people who are working on making it um, easier and more palatable for survivors to report. But that is, of course, a process, and it takes time for communities and people who are in positions of power to figure those things out and learn to
Sure.
trust each other enough to be able to report.
Sure. Sure. All right. Here's a last one under true or false. all races are affected by sexual assault equally.
That is absolutely false. It's a very tough thing, and we do a lot of education around the intersectionality of race and violence, but it's completely false. So Native American women are twice as likely to be assaulted compared to other races. And they're one group where we see kind of a flip in how the assaults happen. They're almost as likely to be assaulted by a stranger as by someone they know, which is absolutely not true of other races. We also see that Black women are far more likely to be murdered by partners than white women are. And there's a whole bunch of statistics that tell you that. But really, anytime you have a situation where there is a lack of privilege, and that absolutely includes race, absolutely. Um,
Sure.
you have set up a dynamic where it is easier to maintain control and abuse another person.
Yeah. So let's go back a little bit. You talk about Native American women. That's a very interesting statistic where they are likely to be abused and assaulted by someone that they don't know. Is there a reason for that? Yeah, is there a reason for that?
I think there are multiple reasons for that. There are cultural differences. There may be even barriers to a Native American woman going and approaching law enforcement. So the consequences for abusing someone who is a Native person is a little less. Um, and then there's the same dynamics that play into any kind of an assault, where there's this some people are more equal than others. And that's really where this comes from, is especially true when we're talking about Native American women, or really any woman of color. Is there's a lot of intersectionality there between race and violence, of
Hmm.
people feeling entitled to ownership of other people's bodies.
Wow. Wow, this is again, this is really good. Again, everybody, we are with Joy Wittenberg from Eve in Violent Encounters, right here in Lansing, and she's our special guest tonight, talking about domestic violence. And this is a huge, huge topic, and particularly for the church, if we want to be salt and light, if we want to be the shalom of the city, the peace of the city, then we cannot just sweep this under the rug. We actually have to talk about it. You can text your questions to the number that you see on the screen, 989-272-2893. And obviously you can drop your comments and questions in the chat. We have seen some of those comments, and man, we stand with you. Thank you for the shout outs, and thank you for letting us know that this is a very important topic, that it's touching you, that it's connecting to you. And this is the reason why we're doing it. And we're so very grateful to have a resource in our city like Eve, and to have a new friend of ours, Joy Wittenberg. All right, Joy. I want to wrap up this segment before we start taking some questions. And I think we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So we've kind of alluded to this already and talked about this, and that is, how come you just don't leave? Why do you stay? Um, and that is more complex than just picking up, packing your bags, and leaving. That's what I again, what I heard you say. It's more complex than that. So when we talk about a person leaving an abusive situation, they need a plan, and you call it a safety plan. So um, why is leaving an abusive situation so dangerous, especially if you don't have a plan? And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics and basics of the plan. But why is it so dangerous for a person to leave an abusive situation without a plan?
Well, I think there's two questions there. There's the question of why doesn't somebody just leave? And then there's why is it so dangerous? So I'll address them one at a time, if that's all right.
That's great.
But there's a lot of reasons why somebody wouldn't just leave an abusive situation. For starters, oftentimes they don't recognize it as being abusive because there is so much emotional and psychological manipulation that's gone on. They legitimately believe that this is all that they deserve, or that they have been the one to create this situation and asked for this to happen. So that's the first thing. But then, even if somebody does decide that they want to leave, there are a lot of very real barriers that make it difficult. There are financial barriers of if I leave, where do I go? 1/3 of homelessness in women is due directly because of domestic violence. They literally have no place to go. And if we're talking about men in a violent situation who have children, very limited resources of where a man can go with children to escape domestic violence, due to just rules and
Wow.
regulations in
Yeah,
shelters,
yeah.
including homeless shelters. So there's very real issues about where would I go. There's the issue of how would I pay for things. There's the issue of how do I keep my children safe if I don't have a custody agreement in place and I leave with my kids and my abuser has access to an attorney. Am I now just about to have to hand my kids back over to an abusive person? And then there's even things that you wouldn't think of, such as um, what will people think of me if I leave and if they find out that this is going on? Or even what would people think of my abuser if I leave? It's a very real thing that oftentimes a survivor still loves the person who's abusing them and is still
Yeah.
concerned about how they'll be perceived in the community.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that is and that goes back to the psychological and the emotional part, right? That that I like I don't have anywhere to go. And he has or she has made me to believe that this is the ironic part. This is the only safe place when it's probably the most dangerous place for that person to be. And so so that's really really good. So now this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, is that we're talking about action now. Now we know a person doesn't necessarily want to stay there, so let's talk about a safety plan. What is a safety plan if a person wants to leave an abusive relationship? And what are some of the basics of a safety plan?
Yeah, so a safety plan is an important part of somebody who wants to leave an abusive situation. And it includes staying safe while you're still in the relationship, staying safe while you're leaving, and then how do you stay safe once you've already left? I've already mentioned some reasons why it's dangerous to leave. But when an abuser starts to feel like they're losing control over their victim, they will do almost anything to regain that control, which is why it's so dangerous to take that step. So I can give you some general tips on safety planning, but I would encourage you to reach out to our crisis line, or to another domestic violence resource center, and start working with an advocate to get your safety plan in place. You know your abuser better than anyone else. So talking them through the unique parts of your situation can help you set up a safety plan that is effective for you and for anyone else in the home. But some of the basics of it would be to start establishing legitimate excuses for you to leave the house for different periods of time that won't arouse suspicion. So that if you need to talk to a crisis advocate, you can. If you need to de-escalate the situation so that you don't have an explosive incident, you can without arousing suspicion. And that's especially important to do right now during stay-at-home orders, when you're less likely to have built-in reasons to leave, like going to the grocery store, going to work, things like that. I would also say stay in touch with as many people as you can. Do not let your network shrink to zero. And then find some trusted people who are aware of what's going on and who you can trust, and establish some code words with them. So if that's your Sunday school teacher, because that's one of the places that you're still allowed to go alone, establish a code word with them. Maybe your code word is cupcakes. And so if you are sensing that an explosive incident is about to happen, you can call your Sunday school teacher and say, hey, I'm thinking about bringing cupcakes this Sunday. What do you think? And then he or she would know, okay, I need to do whatever we discussed previously, whether that's stop by the house to maybe alleviate the tension of being alone with your abuser, or calling the police and having them come by. Whatever it is that you've established, you can alert them that there's a problem without exacerbating the incident. I would encourage people, if possible, if you have a trusted neighbor or someone who is physically close enough by, establish a visual signal. Something
Yeah.
like if I put a potted plant in this window, or if I put this thing out in my yard, then I need your help, right? So that they
Wow.
know to intervene on your behalf.
That's so
Um,
good.
there, there are certain things you can do, like going to smart911.com and setting up a safety profile, so that if you do have to call 911, you don't have to answer quite so many questions. They know if there are guns or weapons in the house. They know if the abusive person uses drugs or alcohol, so that they know how to appropriately respond with the right people. But even things like things you wouldn't normally think of, um, backing your car into the driveway and making sure that it stays fueled, and leaving the driver's side door unlocked so that if you have to leave suddenly, it's faster for you to go. Keeping a bag packed with some personal items, with the paperwork
Mhm.
that you need. And I know we'll talk about that later, but having a bag like that ready to go, and if possible, at a place that's maybe not at your home, just in case you can't grab that on your way out, so that when you do decide to leave, you have that ready. Setting up a savings account at a bank that is different than where you bank as a couple is a great place to start. Even if you can only hide away a few dollars here and there, it's a place to start, right?
Yeah.
And then even talking with your kids about a code word of, if I say this word, that means you go to this neighbor's house and you stay
Yeah.
there until I can get you.
Yeah.
Just basically pre-planning.
That is, man, these are things that we just simply, we simply don't, we don't think about. And there's a level of intricacy and complexity, and yet it is not as simple as I'm just going to pack a bag and leave. That you should have a safety plan in place. So are there any other basics? Are there any other things uh, that a safety plan includes that gets, kind of helps a person to, when it's time to muster up enough courage to leave, they're able to do so. Is there anything else that you would include?
So a lot about that safety planning is just having a place to go when you leave. And is it a place that can take care of you and your kids when you go? And taking the appropriate documents with you, because it may be a while until you can get back to get those if they're not destroyed before you come back. But for you to have access to the resources you need things like birth certificates and your driver's license and a copy of your car insurance and the car title, copies of prescriptions that you might need, a work permit, if there are custody papers, anything like that. If there's a lease or a rental agreement, make copies of that. In some situations, we'll advise people to set up a brand new email account that your abuser doesn't know about, and email copies of these to yourself in case you're not able to get to those. But any like extra keys, keeping a cell phone charged at all times, medication that you might need, because again, if they're not destroyed before you're able to go get them, it may be a while before you can go back. But checkbooks, copies of account statements, anything like that that you might need to restart your life, you need to have prepared.
Wow, wow. So again, talk a little bit more about, okay, we're talking about the you're in the throes of it. So once you find that safety place, is it still in the same city, or is it now outside? Is it in another city, another state? What happens after you find the safe place?
Um, it really depends on your situation. There are certain legal issues, especially if there are children involved before there's a
Yeah.
custody agreement. So you need to be very careful about that. That's part of why when you call a crisis line, they'll ask you those questions, because we have a staff attorney who understands family law and can tell you before you make that decision. Okay, these are the things that we need to have in place before we can do these things, and these are the things I would advise you not to do, because it may not work out how you want it to, or these are the potential ramifications of it. So again, I would encourage you to make a phone call there and use those resources, because it's very case dependent.
Yeah, yeah. So So here's the last question before we get to some of the questions that have come in. Um, when when is the power broken? Because you can be out of a physical situation, you physically separated from the abuser, and still be psychologically wounded. That either there's the temptation to go back, or there is the cycle of getting involved in another abusive situation. So when is the power broken?
That's very much a case by case situation, but that's part of why. That's part of why Eve's model is very empowerment based and why it is so important to have an entire team working with a client when they decide to leave an abusive relationship or even before they decide to take that step. Because in addition to all the, I guess, logistical things that you need to start your life over again from scratch, there is a huge component about how do I deal with the trauma of what's already happened? And then
Mm,
how do I set up better and healthy patterns so that this doesn't happen again and so that I don't fall back into needing the person who is abusing me or feeling like I can't do it on my own again. So Eve is a little bit unique in that you are not required to use all of our services. Of course, you can use whatever you want, but we strongly encourage people that even if you are not thinking that you need counseling or any kind of advocacy like that, we encourage you to take advantage of it because at some point you are going to realize that you need the extra support. And even just having a neutral third party who can kind of help
mm,
you filter through those thoughts that you've been learning in an abusive
sure,
relationship and say, okay, that's not actually true, though, is it?
sure,
You can do
sure.
things by yourself and help you relearn the correct ways to handle things and relearn what's true about yourself versus what you've been told is extremely important in establishing healthy people who are able to go on and rebuild their life.
Yeah, this is so good. This is so good, so helpful, and for a lot of people, whether you have gone through or you're in an abusive situation, or if you know someone who is in. And again, please don't hesitate to share this broadcast because we again we want to make sure that we are salt and light, and we are the shalom, God shalom in the world, and this is one way we can do that. So let's kind of turn the corner and let's hear some questions that have come in. It says, "What do I do if I suspect someone is being abused, but the person doesn't see or accept that they are?" So let me repeat it again. What do I do? This is a person who says, "Oh, man, I think I suspect this, that a person is being abused, but they don't see it, and they don't even accept that this is their reality. What do I do?"
I would say that's probably going to happen, right? And you can't make somebody do what you think is best for them. And even if you could make them, that's not an appropriate thing. Um, if you are dealing with somebody that you are sure is in an abusive situation, they have already lost control over their own life and their own decision making and any kind of independence that an adult should have over their own choices, right? So you do not need to be another person who comes in and takes more of that control away from them. It's not appropriate and
Mm,
it doesn't help them long
that's
term.
good.
So, what you need to do is continue to be support for them and to stand with them and to be the person who believes them, regardless of if they make the choice that you think they should be making or not. They may never decide that they want to change the situation they're in, but that is their choice to do that or not. Your choice is whether or not you're going to continue to be someone that they can go to and trust if they decide to reach out. So you can still be that person that, hey, if you ever want to talk, I'm here. If you ever want somebody to go with you to law enforcement or to our pastor to talk about this, I'll go with you. But whatever you need, let me know. And continue to be that without judging them or without being another person who wants to take over their life.
Wow, that is so rich. Again, that's just the nuance, right? That something that we wouldn't even think about. That, oh, I'll make the call, or I'll do this, I'll do that, and not knowing that we could be exacerbating a pattern of taking control away from them. And so that's really, really good. Here's another question. So they say, I have heard several churches and victims of abuse say things like, as long as the abuse is not physical, which I think we've kind of talked about a little bit, that it is okay. What would you say to that church or that abused person? Says as long as it's not physical, then it's not abuse. What would you say? And again, I think we've covered a little bit of that, but you may want to add something to that.
Sure. So I would say that abuse escalates, and you cannot accurately predict when it's going to escalate to a physically harmful situation. But aside from that, um, emotional and psychological abuse is oftentimes just as damaging as physical abuse. And more than what's happening to just that person, I think as a church, we have to step back and think about who's watching that interaction play out and who's learning from that interaction what's okay and what's appropriate to do. um, who else is being impacted by that? Um, and do I want to be the one who excuses behavior? So again, you may not be the one who can actually solve that situation or make a choice for the person who's in that relationship. But if somebody is reaching out and wanting help because of any form of abuse, you absolutely have a responsibility to help them get the help that they need and get them to a place that is safe, not just physically, but also emotionally. And
Mhm.
to kind of piggyback off of this, I should have mentioned this after the last question, but the caveat to stepping in is that if there is abuse happening to a child, a lot of us are mandated reporters, and we're mandated reporters for a reason, because
Yeah.
children don't have the capacity to advocate for themselves or make decisions for themselves. So that is a completely different scenario than an adult who's in
Yeah.
an abusive situation.
Yeah, that raises another question that came in, and I'll piggyback off that. So, if we're again mandated reporters for children, would that same mandate be true for those with disabilities?
Absolutely. So that's why adult protective services is a very real thing. So people with disabilities or people who fall into the category of elder, we have an entire department at Eve that's all about abuse in later life because these are vulnerable populations. So absolutely, if somebody is incapacitated and unable to advocate for themselves, then yes, we should be using those resources that are out there. What I will say is that having access to resources can really help that situation out. So, a lot of times there is this fear from a parent of if I go to authorities or if I report this now, will I also be in trouble for allowing this to happen? And that's a very real fear. But what I would suggest is again, reach out to experts, advocates, and people in this field who can help you navigate that process and help you work with law enforcement and the different people to get you and your kids to a safe place. You don't have to
Yeah.
do it on your own.
Yeah, that's really, really good. So here's another question. And for all of those individuals who have a justice streak in them and they see public abuse happening, whether it's a husband, wife, significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend, so forth and so on. And they see that happening in a public square, public setting.
Mhm.
What should we do? Like there's a justice streak in me. There's a justice streak in others who would want to step in and do something. Again, we don't necessarily know this person, but there's just something in us that says this is wrong, this is injustice, and we want to do something about it. Like, would you advise me to step into a situation and stop the abuse from happening?
So that's a very sticky and potentially very dangerous situation that you're describing. For starters, if you're witnessing physical abuse happening in public, you are watching a power dynamic play out where the abuser is so comfortable in the control that they have over that person that they are not afraid of consequences happening in public. They're essentially saying to the person they're abusing that um, you are so worthless that nobody cares what happens to you. And I can do this in front of anyone and it won't matter. And part of that I don't want to say it's true, but there is a lot of truth to the statement that when terrible things happen in public, it is sometimes easy to walk past and overlook with the thought that somebody else will do something about it. What I would encourage people to do if you do see that happening is um, you don't know if the person who's being abusive has weapons on them. There's no way for you to know that. And you don't know the potential that lies behind that violent person. I would especially caution that if you're a man and you see an abusive relationship happening in front of you from a man towards a woman, if you were to step in, it will most likely in almost every situation escalate the situation and spiral out of control, because again you're trying to take control away from an abusive person and they will go to great lengths to make sure that that doesn't happen. So it is very dangerous for you to physically step in. You do have other options. So if you see that this is going on, I would encourage you to take out your cell phone, and anybody else who's around to take out their cell phone and start recording what's happening in front of you, in part because you can shame the person that is doing this into seeing, oh, people are noticing, and there might be a record of what I'm doing. If it does go to a situation where the person who's being abused or even the prosecutor wanted to take it to prosecution, they would have some evidence, which would help in that situation. But it also can kind of snap the person who's perpetuating this abuse out of their comfort zone, because now there are other people seeing this and there's a shame element. And it may also, the person who's being abused, it may prompt them to start seeing what's happening from somebody else's perspective. If you're in a situation where you witness something violent happen and then there is the abuser steps slightly away or in a place where you don't have to physically get between them and the person they're abusing, you can, if you're comfortable with it and if you're sure that it's something that you want to do, um, offer help to the person who was being assaulted in the form of, would you like me to call the police? Would you like me to go to the police station with you? Would you like the crisis line number that I have here? If it's a situation where they look like they're not interested in leaving, but you want to give them the crisis line number when they're ready to reach out, I would certainly encourage that. And then you always have the option of calling 911. But I do want to caution people who have this gut feeling to step in and intervene, that in about 20% of homicides that happen in domestic violence situations, the person killed is not the person who is being abused. It is a member of law enforcement or a neighbor, a family member, somebody who's a
Wow.
bystander. So you need to be very careful. And you need to make sure that you are not putting yourself or potentially your children, if they're with you, in a potentially dangerous situation as well.
Yeah, that is so good and good advice. Good advice to all those who, they've wanted to step in, and just all of the ramifications of the potential ramifications of stepping in. So one more question, and then we're gonna have to shut it down. This is such a good conversation, Joy. Really, really good conversation. So, so all of those Christian husbands who use the verse and the passage, submit, wives should submit to their husbands as a guise for some form of abuse. What would you say?
I would say that if you wanted to, you could get the Bible to say a lot of things that it was never intended to say. Um, so I would caution you that if your definition of submission includes having control over another person, you are misusing the Bible and you're doing it for your own benefit. Frankly, somebody who's in a position of power should not be somebody who thinks it's appropriate to intimidate another person. And there are plenty of verses in the Bible that talk about everyone being a part of the body of Christ and how we all have our own roles and how we're all equal to each other and we're all just as important and just as necessary. And in fact, there are verses that talk about in Christ, there is no male or female, that we're all just Christians and we're all children of God. So if if you're using the Bible to justify something that gives you control over another person, I would say maybe reach out to somebody and get a third opinion on what's appropriate and what isn't.
Yeah, you again, you are preaching, you know your Bible, And that is a good thing because you're absolutely right. The Bible talks about mutual submission, husbands and wives having this mutual submission out of reverence for Christ. And so thank you for that. And man, thank you for those who are tuning in. We're so grateful. We're gonna put that hotline number back on the screen just for a few seconds, and then I'm gonna give Joy the last words in terms of what would your last words to individuals that you think are being people who think others are being abused, or if they are in an abusive situation. So here's the number. Again, if you were wondering, there is a secured chat line, and so that your information is confidential. And so again, it's right on the screen. If you need to write it down, please do. If you want to share this broadcast, it will be available for you to share as well. For those who are not able to make it tonight, they're able to view this at a later time. And so Joy, let me ask just one last thing. You have the last word on this, and before we say goodnight, anything else you would say to someone um, who might be in an abusive situation, or they think someone is in an abusive situation? What is your encouragement to those individuals, and then what is your encouragement to us as the Church of Jesus Christ?
Yeah. So, uh, for starters, if you are in an abusive relationship, I want to stress to you that all the services at Eve are 100% free. We don't check your income. You could be a millionaire. If you reach out to us and you need help, all of our services are free. And you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. We will give you your options. We'll tell you what resources are available, but we will follow your lead and help you make the decisions that you want to make. It is confidential. We don't gather information. We're not going to send the police to your house if you don't ask us to. You can call and get advice and know what your options are before you make any decisions. I would encourage you to do that. You can call back as many times as you need to get your options laid out and to talk through this with someone. But to people who know of someone who may be in a violent situation, or maybe you think that I've never seen this, it's not happening in my neighborhood. I'm telling you that it is. The numbers tell us you know somebody that this is happening to, and they aren't going to come to you and they're not going to reach out to you if they don't think that you're a safe person to turn to. So, how do you become a safe person? You need to take a very strong stand publicly about how you feel about survivors, that you believe survivors, that you stand with them, and that you as a person are not going to sit around and not make a scene if violence is happening. So, a lot of times we'll see this happen where if I'm in an argument with someone or somebody says something that is very sexist or very racist or totally inappropriate, arguing with that person or correcting that person is not going to change that person's way of thinking. It isn't. We know that confirmation bias is a real thing. I'm not correcting them for their benefit. I'm taking a stand and letting people who can hear me know that I am with you and that I believe you and I don't agree with this person. And I have a big enough mouth that I will speak for you if you want me to. And that's how you become a safe place for people to reach out to so that you know who needs your help. And as a church, I would encourage you, this is such a passion project for me. As soon as a church reaches out to Eve, I jump on it and say, I want to talk to them. This is my thing. Because I believe that you have the unique opportunity to reach people who are hurting, in part because logistically, church is sometimes the last place that abused people are allowed to go without their abuser. So you may be the last line of defense, but also because you have a natural trust sometimes when people come to your church. You're in a position of power frequently. You're at a place where people hopefully have their guards down a little bit. You're representing Christ. So you have the opportunity to be a light sometimes to people who may not trust anyone else. So, in addition to the responsibility that I think churches have, I think that churches have an access into the hearts and into the souls of people that sometimes coworkers or neighbors just don't have. Um, my favorite verse in the Bible, and the one that I cling to, is to whom much is given, much is required. So if you are part of a church congregation that has helped you through whatever hurts and hardships you've faced, and we've all faced them, it is now your turn to turn around and find somebody who needs you that you can pour yourself into. And I promise you, someone in your community needs your help in this way. So find a way to help them through this.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Joy Wittenberg. Joy, you are a gift, and you're a gift to the body of Jesus. You're a gift to this area here in Lansing, and Eve is a gift to us. And so, thank you for being generous with your time. Thank you for your passion, and thank you for just showing us, things that we might not have known. And then lastly, thank you for preaching like 3 or 4 sermons in this time. So we're very, very grateful. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for another Better Together conversation where we attempted to tackle the large, relevant subject of domestic violence. And Joy did a phenomenal, phenomenal job. And thank you for joining us because, we are better together. Have a great night, and we'll see you for the next Better Together next month. And we'll talk with you then. Good night.